First off, this video has no sponsor, but I am holding a small sale on the merch store. I am putting the Retro Gamer shirt on a very limited time sale because it is a very good deal for that price. And this is an actual good quality shirt. I didn't just go with the cheapest manufacturer, like some hucksters out there do. So if you want to support my content and get some sweet merch in return, now is the time, and a link will be in the description below. Anyways... Hey internets, there's been a recent discussion going around the internet about the supposed woke right, or the claim that woke ideology is spreading and becoming popular within the right wing of political discourse and whatnot. In this video I'm going to explain why the woke right isn't really a thing, at least not in the way those of us on the libertarian right define right wing. We tend to look at being right wing as being pro-individual, pro-free market, and also pro-time preferences, or an emphasis on the cultural values that have been proven to build society rather than consume or destroy society. So there's a very strong recognition within sort of libertarian right thinking that equality isn't really a thing. There are cultural values that are more sustainable than others, and there are individuals who do more to build society than other individuals. And that this obvious fact is often seen as something that is politically incorrect to say is one of the main problems within Western society in our modern times. That we aren't really willing to say things that are obviously true, just because it goes against care-harm morality. However, on the subject of wokeness itself, the main problem with this woke right narrative comes from a confusion not so much what being right-wing is, but more so from a confusion of what wokeness is. Because one lefty liberal complaint that I often see that I actually do understand as somewhat of a valid complaint is that too many right-wingers really do just use the word woke to describe things about the left that they don't really like. They don't really have a coherent definition of just what exactly specifically woke ideology is, which then results in a lot of people in general having no idea what woke ideology actually is. And that's a pretty big problem, because when nobody knows what people are talking about when a word is being thrown about, that word inevitably just ends up becoming a snarl word. It effectively loses all meaning. So the word woke is definitely in danger of becoming the right-wing version of how breadtubers called everything they don't like to be Nazism. They just kind of throw that word out as kind of a snarl word that they think automatically debunks whatever you're saying. Because unfortunately that is exactly the kind of pseudo-intellectualism I'm seeing in this sort of narrative about the emergence of the woke right. So to prevent us from falling into that pit trap, let's start out with clearly explaining what is meant by wokeness, going a bit more in detail over things I've said before in other videos. Personally, in the past, I've defined wokeness as an aggressive push for diversity, equity, inclusion, usually based on the belief that outcomes which lack these things are indicative of discrimination and or unfair social treatment. Now, the first thing to really point out here is understanding that DEI is an inherently collectivist way of thinking. It implies that people are being treated differently depending on which group they are assumed to belong to. And so wokeness is inherently collectivist. So this whole aggressive push for DEI is really just a modern day iteration of something that has existed for a long time, which is this type of collectivist thought and collectivist envy and collectivist disdain for the people who are deemed to be more successful. So rather than success being something to look up to and admire, the success is instead seen as a mark of original sin. And from this collectivist thinking, hatred and disdain is then justified against those who have done well in society based purely on their collective group and collective identity. And this is very important to understand, because one of the ways that woke ideology sort of gets its claws into society is that it masquerades as good. It masquerades as justice, hence the term social justice. It creates a sort of victim-oppressor dichotomy and claims that people in the less successful victim class are victims of the oppressor class, which they then place the people who have been successful into, which is absolutely not moral and ethical at all because it implies collective guilt. It inherently necessitates holding people accountable for things that they had no part in, and often those things they are being held accountable to, in addition to being collective guilt, are things that aren't even real crimes. Which is the next big thing to really point out here. Wokeness is an ideology that relies very heavily on subjective morality. The unfair social treatment can be anything. It can be completely made up emotional harm from the care-harm morality that the far left tends to follow, which is a very important thing to understand. Their claims to victimhood are entirely subjective and completely unfalsifiable. It's impossible to prove that the hurt feels don't exist, because anybody can claim that for any reason. Anybody can subjectively claim to have been emotionally harmed by something, and that is the reason why they aren't as successful. And it does not need to make sense in the way that care harm morality works. So the ideology does not require them to have any real evidence to this type of claim. It can be completely made up, unfalsifiable conjecture, and that is a feature of wokeness, not a bug. It's very logically incoherent. Woke ideology tends to come packed with a lot of intentionally fallacious reasoning. For instance, going back to the collectivist brainrot, it is almost always an ecological fallacy, where it is falsely assumed that traits of a group always apply to individuals within that group, or the reverse, a compositional fallacy, where the traits of an individual are assumed to always apply to the group, for which the individual is deemed to be a part of for whatever reason. And that's an important thing for people to really understand. If there's one thing about wokeness that everybody needs to grasp, it is the collectivist envy and collectivist guilt element of it, which they then back up with subjective claims about emotional harm that cannot actually be disproven, as they are not actually based on any real evidence. Which is what makes woke ideology so incredibly evil. It masquerades itself by oversimplifying the concept of justice as something that can be applied to every individual, regardless of their actual involvement, and in some cases, regardless of whether or not the crime even really happened, or if what happened can even be considered a crime to begin with. And that's because, ultimately, wokeness is just a pseudo-intellectual way to justify the collectivist envy. It's an attempt to put an academic gloss on the act of viewing success as the result of some kind of collective crime. Crimes that, again, can be completely subjective, unfalsifiable nonsense. Nearly every single genocide in human history has been justified using this kind of faulty collectoid reasoning. Now, in the current modern day, this has manifested as DEI. It generally claims that white people have gained a status of unearned privilege through systemic discrimination and oppression of those who are not white. This is why when you see DEI being pushed by the far left, and then you look at the praxis of what they're actually doing, it usually just means having less white people around. And when you realize this, another thing you might notice is that another really big component of woke ideology is that it tends to be very inconsistent, and it tends to apply very different rules to different people, depending on which collective group they're seen to be a part of. So for example, this is where the statement, "only white people can be racist," comes from. When the far left says this, the justification they give is of course that racism is prejudice plus power, which of course implies that all white people are collectively guilty of it, which again will inevitably run into some kind of ecological or compositional fallacy. Before you even start to look into whether or not that prejudice and power even exists, which oftentimes it really doesn't, especially when you look at the individual, and remember why collective guilt isn't really a thing. But of course that's not what really matters, because that's just the woke scolds attempting to make themselves look like they're standing up for the victims, when really they're just justifying using different rules against different people. And so really, it is all just pseudo-intellectualism in order to justify impugning the collective guilt. But it's also why wokeness can sometimes come in very subversive, bizarre forms. For example, a lot of people have trouble understanding why Muh representation in media can often be seen as woke. And the reason it's often woke really just comes from the justification behind it. It's done based on the belief that the reason they don't have enough representation already, allegedly, is because they are, again, collectively victimized. Which is why a lot of representation characters tend to be really poorly written Mary Sues. They're almost always one of the good guys of the story, and they almost always have no real flaws, which ironically often results in them being one-dimensional characters. They exist purely to represent some quote-unquote oppressed minority, and thus resolve some of that collective victimhood by giving them the spotlight, even if it doesn't really make sense in the context of the story for that spotlight to exist. This is one of the reasons why a lot of movies in the last decade or so have been very predictable and stale, because there's often a focus on this political representation first, and actually making well-written stories second, and thus the quality of the theater is sacrificed on the altar of ideology. And so this modern current iteration of wokeness, and by modern I mean been around since the civil rights era, is very tied down to a type of collective ethnic guilt. This is why you will see things like privilege checking. They will call out white people as a collective group and claim that your success is at least partially built on a foundation of privilege, which of course is just an ecological fallacy. Again, when you understand the faulty reasoning behind wokeness and how to spot it, it becomes a lot easier to identify wokery, and to not just call it out, but also explain why it is wrong. That's again something I see a lot of people not really grasping, because some people will incorrectly define wokeness as simply being against discrimination, which is a terrible way to define woke ideology, because that, in fact, is what the woke scolds want you to think. Woke ideologues want you to think that they are simply against mistreatment of people based on immutable traits, which is really not what wokeness is at all. If that was true, then certain aspects of woke ideology, such as the progressive stack, would not exist. They wouldn't try to elevate people's status based on their gender, race, or other identity based on their membership to being some kind of historically marginalized group. And they wouldn't try to belittle someone based on their membership to a group which the wokes view as historically privileged. And I think that's another reason why a lot of people have trouble sort of pinning down what woke ideology specifically is. It is inherently a very dishonest and deceptive ideology that includes a lot of inherently subjective and contradictory elements. That's why my definition of wokeness includes includes the words usually and belief. They don't always actually try to use this justification that they claim it's the result of discrimination. And it's just a belief. It's a claim that they make. It's their purported justification. The problem is actually that their claims of discrimination and victimhood aren't true. That's the main difference between what makes something victimhood and what makes someone an actual victim of a real crime. True recognition of a crime is not wokeness. For example, imagine if someone set fire to your house and then the arsonist laughed at you and accused you of playing the victim when you tried to take him to court for the act of burning your house down. What makes it victimhood within woke ideology and what makes it fake is that the victimhood comes in the form of things that aren't real property crimes. And this is why the way at least libertarian right defines being right-wing, wokeness within the right isn't really a thing. Because if you are pro-individual and pro-free markets, this ultimately means that you are pro-property rights. To believe in these two things, you must also believe that individuals have bodily autonomy, that the consent of the individual matters, and that a person can create private property through things like homesteading, and that this is an extension of their property rights, because they use the labor of the body that they have autonomy over to transform that which is in nature to something that is uniquely theirs. There really isn't room for collectivist victimhood in this kind of thinking. If you believe in collective victimhood, especially when it comes to things that aren't even real violations of property rights, for example, woke scolds will often claim to be victims of hurt feelings, using care-harm morality and exploiting the subjectivity of that type of morality to claim victimhood where no crime has occurred. If you believe in that kind of thinking and you agree with it, then you aren't really right-wing. However, of course, in the way that most people define right-wing, most people view it as sort of a subset of various different ideologies, which we just kind of traditionally assume to be on the right. And so, to some degree, there is kind of a collectivist right. For example, Wignots or the National Socialist types essentially agree with a lot of Marxist takes on the collective. They just do it from a standpoint of being pro-white identity rather than anti-white identity. And so they're partially right-wing because they're pro-time preferences, but I would actually argue that they give in to a lot of leftist thinking when it comes to individual rights and individual freedom, and especially the free market, because you actually see a lot of sort of leftist economic takes coming from the Wignots as well. I have definitely seen from these people some, quote, conservative, unquote, takes on why capitalism is bad, unless we should somehow create a conservative version of communism to combat it, which is of course absurd because communism doesn't work. But I would argue that this is actually just a result of that ideology not really being fully right-wing, but rather those components of their ideology are actually examples of them giving in to leftist thinking and far left ways of looking at power dynamics. Because of course left and right aren't really true binaries. Very few people are fully to the right or fully to the left. And honestly, I'm not sure if you can really consider the Wignots or the Groypers to be woke, because they admit that they're not really for equality. They don't really have collectivist envy towards success, so they don't really utilize the equity fallacy at all, and they certainly don't push for DEI. They mostly just want to live in a homogenous society, and they are just very deeply misguided on how to get that. And the silly thing is, a lot of that misguidedness comes from them having a few left-leaning beliefs within their ideology. Which brings me to my next point, which is that most of the people who have been throwing the term woke right around are ironically the people who are guilty of having some woke thoughts of their own. For example, there's a lot of sort of centrist, conservative, liberal types out there who have some right-leaning beliefs again, but they still give in to the left on certain parts of the ideology. For example, people who kind of lean to the right, but still have yet to realize why the Civil Rights Act of 1964 wasn't actually a good piece of legislation. They don't realize that civil rights in practice is actually just the equity fallacy. It allows neo-Marxists to thus use the state as a way to push their ideology by pointing to any unequal outcome they don't like, keywords unequal outcomes they don't like, because again, they're not consistent on this, and therefore claiming that it accounts towards an illegal form of discrimination. And a lot of center-right libs who believe in a kind of slightly right-leaning version of liberal democracy, they often don't really see the contradiction in this. They often don't realize that the Civil Rights Act, in practice, is really just the current beat stick that the far-left neo-Marxists are using as a way to aggressively push their ideology. And so I see this very sad confusion amongst the conservative liberal types, where they correctly identify how the neo-Marxists are using false accusations of discrimination as a way to push Marxist ideology, but then they don't want to abolish the legislation which allows the Marxists to do that. Which is weird, because a lot of times these people on the center-right, they've correctly recognized the equity fallacy. They understand why equity is just a disingenuous tactic by Marxists in order for them to gain power and stay in power. But then they don't want to abolish the legislation which allows Marxists to point to inequities and claim victimhood. Which is sad to see, because a lot of these centrist liberal conservative types, they've already figured it out, they just have yet to put the two-piece puzzle together. They have yet to realize that the equity crap and civil rights law are the same problem. I have pointed this out many times before. if you actually look up and read the disparate impact standard, which is how civil rights law is actually enacted, it is legitimately just the equity fallacy. And it is currently enshrined into law, and it has been enshrined into United States law for a very long time now. And not only that, but most other Western countries have something similar to it for, again, a very long time now. And then often the centrist conservatives look around wondering why the neo-Marxists keep winning. And the answer is because it's currently illegal for them to lose. When the Marxists can just point to every collective inequity, that allows them to then push for their collective guilt, with the aggressive force of the state at their beck and call. And what makes the grift really effective is they don't even need to threaten litigation at this point, because Western society has been so gaslit into this style of thinking that they can simply point out the inequities, and the threat is simply done by implication. For instance, there was a recent sting against Valve Software for not having enough diversity, which of course by that word they mean that Valve Software has too many white guys. And a lot of people just don't understand why this move has so much power behind it. And what they really don't get about it is that it's all about freedom of association. Because when these center-right libs are giving into this style of thinking, what they don't realize is that they're actually violating people's property rights. Going back to being pro-individual and pro-free market, and thus respecting people's property rights, when you say that person A has to associate with person B, because if they don't, that would make person B feel bad, what you're really saying there is that it's perfectly okay for person A to be enslaved to person B, based purely on subjective hurt feels, which may or may not even really exist, which just further emphasizes how ridiculous this enslavement is. People should not be forced to serve others if they do not wish to do so, and so no individual is entitled to a job at some prestigious company purely on the grounds of collective guilt. And I see a lot of people on the center-right not really quite grasping that. They don't realize that they're actually going against individual property rights when they refuse to get rid of the legislation that allows for the equity beatstick to be used in this way. They don't realize that the neo-Marxists are actually taking advantage of a hole in the liberal system, which innately allows the Marxists to push their ideology through the act of violating people's freedom of association that this legislation ultimately allows for. In other words, when you give evil an inch, it takes a mile, and evil will always try to pretend to be good. In this instance, they're pretending to stand up for the little guy. They are pretending to care about the poor, oppressed minority. But really, they're just coming from a place of collective envy and using collective guilt as a beatstick to force you into compliance. And it won't stop, by the way. If you give them that inch, they'll just keep taking more and more and more until all the power is in their hands, and that is their true goal. The equality grift that they try to pull, that they claim to believe in, that's just their pseudo-intellectual justification. They really just want you to keep giving them power. And that is what I wish a lot of normies understood when they see this kind of behavior. So what does this mean for the true woke right? Well, again, a lot of the discussion comes from not really understanding what wokeness is. But now that I've kind of explained that in extreme detail, for the rest of this video, I'd like to focus on a specific example, which is this explanation of what the woke right is from James Lindsay on America Uncovered. And in it, he gets a few things correct. For example, it is true that there is a victims-oppressor dichotomy within wokeness. That's mainly where the collectivist envy against the successful people comes from, and how they justify the collective guilt, is that they claim that those people who have been successful are oppressing the people who have not been successful, and that those people are therefore victims of the oppressors. And that woke ideology stems from that kind of faulty reasoning. To that extent, James Lindsay is right. However, much of else what he has to say really is very much off the mark. Mainly, he mistakes symptoms of woke ideology for woke ideology itself, or he's looking at a lot of patterns of behavior that a lot of the far-left neo-Marxists partake in, and confusing those behaviors for wokeness itself, which again is a very big problem because it goes back to saying everything I don't like is wokeness. Just like a lot of far lefties like to say that everything they don't like is literally bad mustache man. And you really don't want to do that. So the first thing he's wrong on is thinking that cancel culture is wokeness. Cancel culture is not really wokeness. In fact, when people on the right do it, it's really usually just physical removal. It's just freedom of association being used to oust someone who they view as being cringe. And yes, it's true that far left woke scolds do this as well. However, there's a slight difference, which is that cancel culture on the left usually comes with that implication of that disparate impact beatstick. When lefties partake in cancel culture, it's usually them falsely accusing someone of discrimination, such as accusing a content creator of creating hateful or otherwise bigoted content, which again is ironic because woke ideology actually is bigoted. It's just only bigoted against the groups that they view as historically advantaged, and then attempting to get them banned from big tech or something like that. And so they kind of mass flag and mass report you in an attempt to get you banned, or shadow banned, or if you have enough followers, they'll demonetize you, which is really just another form of of shadow banning. Due to how the algorithm works, it tends to push monetized content up the search algorithm. So as far as the message goes, it's the same thing. That's kind of the high-tech version of cancel culture today. And that again kind of comes with that implication of that beat stick. They're implying to the big tech company that if they allow this kind of speech on their platform, that they are in violation of disparate impact legislation. And that's an important thing to understand, because a lot of time far-left Marxists will pretend to use the "it's a private company" argument, saying that a private platform can do whatever they want. But the thing is, they don't actually believe that. They don't actually believe in freedom of association. And you can clearly see that because their false flags and false reports partially come from a place of power dynamics which denies freedom of association. If they actually believe that private platforms should be able to do whatever they want, they would be against that legislation as well, which of course they're not. However, canceling when it comes from the right usually does not come in the form of them using shady tactics to try and deplatform someone. Usually it instead comes in the form of you being dogpiled and told by thousands of people why you're wrong. So it's usually not really the same thing. It's a similar behavior, but it is not the thing itself. It is not woke ideology itself. The act of cancel culture is usually more of an act that only works if you have some form of power on your side. And so in this way, the establishment right, the sort of center-right liberals, they are the ones who are, ironically, more in a position where they are able to partake in cancel culture. And you will, in fact, often see this. A lot of times, the center-right, establishment right, will use their power to either kick out the dissident right or the libertarian right or some other right-wingers who don't currently control as much state power as they do. So that take from Lindsay just kind of seems to stem from a poor understanding of what the difference is between cancel culture and physical removal, at least not in a principled, consistent way. And this seems to stem from the fact that James Lindsay only kind of understands what wokeness is. He seems to define it in a video as believing that there is a oppressor-based structure to social reality. He doesn't put enough emphasis on the collectivist element, nor does he really call out the fallacies of that collectivist brainrot. And especially, he fails to call out the fallacies of egalitarian thinking. And without that, you kind of miss the element of collective envy that wokeness truly comes from. It's kind of missing that it's all just a pseudo-intellectual justification for that type of disdain. And it absolutely has quite a bit to do with Marxism, because he also makes the claim that it has nothing to do with Marxism. In fact, wokeness is really just the logical conclusion of Marxist thought. Marxist thought does the same thing with class envy and class collective guilt, whereas woke ideology, which you can often call just neo-Marxist ideology, simply takes that and applies it to all aspects of identity, while keeping the same thing of blaming it all on the group that is viewed as successful, which they construe as the group that is advantaged. Lindsay also just completely gets wrong what Hans Hermann Hoppe means about what Marx gets right. If you actually listen to the lecture from Hans Hermann Hoppe on what Karl Marx gets right, it's actually all about how Marxist collectivist ideas are all completely stupid, and how Marxist philosophy completely misses the concept of time preferences. And thus Marx ended up creating a fake victim class, which distracted from the people who were actually, as individuals, committing real property rights crimes. So the whole claim Marx got some things right is more like a way to bait the Marxists into listening to him, when in reality Hans Hermann Hoppe's ideas completely turn Marxism on their head. And of course anybody who's actually read Hans Hermann Hoppe or listened to his lectures knows this. And so I'll just give Lindsay the benefit of doubt here and assume that he just isn't very well read on this particular subject. Overall, he seems to be saying that it's the dissident right who is the woke right. And he also lumps all of the dissident right and all of the libertarian right in the same camp as the Wignots, basically anybody who isn't a boomer conservative, of wanting to expel the Jews, which is just completely false and way off the mark. First off, as far as libertarian right goes, there are tons of Jewish thinkers within the Austrian school. And to be a Hoppian also includes rejecting collective guilt. So you genuinely cannot believe that the Jews are collectively guilty of anything and still fit in with that ideology. I mean, Hans Hermann Hoppe's teacher, Murray Rothbard, who is also a major figure within libertarian right and Austrian school thinking, was a Jew. And so to just kind of randomly accuse us of anti-Semitism, it just completely comes out of left field. It's a blatantly false accusation. It's like he has absolutely no idea what any of the factions of the right wing that he's name-dropping in this video actually believes in. So very incoherent, very flawed, very contradictory takes from him here. And also, ironically enough, very much kind of a leftist take. What he's effectively doing is he's taking everybody who isn't a center-right liberal or boomer conservative and then falsely painting them as evil Nazis, which is normally a tactic that the woke left uses. It all stems from this bizarre idea that anybody who believes in equality less than you do must be bad mustache man, which of course is completely ridiculous. And so my conclusion here is that the woke right, if there is a woke right, is a term that really is best applied to sort of the establishment right boomer conservative types. The conservatives who more or less just dislike the symptoms of wokeness, but but don't actually fully understand what wokeness is, and don't actually want to get rid of woke ideology as it actually stands. They want to continue the egalitarian liberal dream that woke ideology relies on. They just want to turn back the clock to the 1980s or 1990s, and hope that the same symptoms don't manifest again. That is what you can consider to be the woke right, the form of pseudo-right-wing thought where their strategy is just unconditional, constant surrender to the neo-Marxists where they cede more ground every decade or so. The kind of conservative who will tell you that the Civil Rights Act was a good thing, or try to argue that Martin Luther King Jr. would be a conservative if he were alive today. Which, there's actually already a term for this, and the term is woke light. The people who claim on the surface to dislike wokeness, but still believe that there's a way that the liberal equality utopia can be achieved, without understanding that the fact that it cannot be achieved, and the fact that attempts to do so necessitate the violation of people's true rights, their property rights, is exactly what is allowing the Marxists to come in and subvert society. And that is all I have to say on the matter. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and all that stuff. And if you like my content enough to support me, you can do so on either Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or by buying some merch. Till next time.